The midday sun baked the dust of Redemption's main street into a fine pale powder that clung to everything. It settled on the sweat-slicked flanks of tethered horses, coated the brims of hats, and found its way through the cracks of the boardwalk to the parched earth below. Inside the First National Bank of Redemption, the air was still and thick with the smell of old paper steel and the faint, cloying sweetness of pomade. The only sounds were the lazy buzz of a fly and the methodical scratch of a clerk's pen. Elias Vance stood before the teller's cage, his reflection a tired ghost in the polished brass. At 50, his face was a roadmap of a hard life, creases etched by sun and sorrow radiated from the corners of his pale blue eyes. His hands resting on the smooth mahogany counter were scarred and calloused, but their movements were deliberate, gentle. He pushed a small canvas bag of coins across the counter, the last of the payment for a dozen head of cattle. It was a good sale, enough to see him through the winter and keep his small ranch solvent, enough to maintain the quiet solitude he had cultivated for the last 10 years. That should do it, Mr. Vance, the young clerk, barely old enough to sprout a proper mustache, said with a nervous smile. Elias had been a U.S. Marshal for 2 decades, and though his badge had been gathering dust for a decade, the town of Redemption had a long memory. The shadow of his authority still clung to him like a second skin. Elias nodded, his gaze distant. He wasn't thinking of the money or the ranch. His thumb and forefinger went instinctively to the fob pocket of his waistcoat, tracing the cool, familiar outline of the silver locket nestled there. Inside was a miniature portrait of Sarah, her smile as bright and clear as the day it was painted 20 years ago. Before the fever, before the silence descended on his life. The quiet was shattered by a sound that didn't belong. Not the creak of the saloon doors or the rumble of a passing wagon, but the sharp, violent splintering of wood as the bank's front door was kicked open. 3 men spilled into the room, their faces obscured by dusty bandanas. They moved with a predatory efficiency, shotguns leveling on the clerk and the bank manager, who froze hands halfway in the air. The townsfolk, a rancher and his wife, cowered in a corner. Elias didn't move. He'd seen this dance 100 times. He stood still, a pillar of calm in the burgeoning chaos, his mind assessing, calculating. He was unarmed. His Colt Peacemaker was back at the ranch, a relic of a life he had sworn to leave behind. A 4th man entered, and the atmosphere in the room shifted. He was taller than the others, dressed in a tailored black coat that was immaculate despite the dust outside. He moved not with the brutish urgency of a common thief, but with the measured grace of a wolf entering a sheep pen. He pulled down his bandana, revealing a face that was handsome, intelligent, and marked by a cold, unnerving smile. This was no common outlaw. This was Silas Blackwood. His reputation had preceded him, a plague rolling across the territory. Blackwood didn't just rob, he dismantled. He broke towns, corrupted officials, and bought up land with money and fear. Gentlemen, Blackwood's voice was smooth-cultured, a jarring contrast to the crude violence of his men. An unfortunate but necessary interruption to your day. Please remain calm, and this will be over momentarily. His men went to work stuffing cash into leather sacks. But Blackwood's eyes, the color of cold steel, were not on the money. They were fixed on Elias. He walked slowly, his boots making no sound on the floorboards, until he stood directly in front of the retired marshal. The air crackled between them. Elias Vance Blackwood said, his smile widening. It didn't reach his eyes. The hero of Redemption, the man who tamed the West and then vanished. It is an honor. Elias said nothing. His jaw was a hard line. He met Blackwood's gaze without flinching his own eyes, holding the flat, dangerous calm of a coiled rattlesnake. We're not here just for the bank's money. Blackwood continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. He gestured to one of his men, who roughly patted Elias down, finding nothing. Blackwood's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, a flicker of annoyance. No gun, the legendary Elias Vance without his trusty peacemaker, how disappointing. You've gone soft in your retirement. He leaned closer, his gaze dropping to Elias's waistcoat. But I know you carry something of value. Something more precious than gold. Before Elias could react, Blackwood's hand darted out. His fingers, surprisingly slender and strong, slipped into the fob pocket and emerged with the silver locket. It dangled from its chain, twisting slowly in the dim light, a tiny silver moon. A cold rage, an emotion Elias hadn't felt in years, surged through him. It was a physical thing, a burning in his chest that threatened to consume him. "Give that back," he said, his voice a low growl. It was the first thing he had said, and the words were heavy with menace. Blackwood clicked the locket open with his thumb. He stared at the tiny portrait of Sarah, his expression unreadable. "Such a beautiful woman," he murmured. "A tragedy what happened to her. To lose someone you love. It leaves a mark, doesn't it?" He snapped the locket shut and pocketed it. "I'll be keeping this. A souvenir." The robbery was over in less than 5 minutes. The men backed out their shotguns, still trained on the terrified occupants. Blackwood was the last to leave. He paused in the doorway, framed by the blinding afternoon sun, and looked back at Elias. The cold smile returned, but now it was tinged with something else, something that looked like triumph. He leaned in, his voice barely audible over the sudden shocked silence of the bank. "You took everything from me once, Marshal." He whispered the words, a venomous secret meant only for Elias. "It's only fair I start taking things back." Then he was gone. Hoofbeats thundered. Dust choked the air. The townsfolk began to weep. The clerk stammered, but Elias heard none of it. He stood frozen, the whisper echoing in the hollow space where the locket used to be. "You took everything from me." The words made no sense, yet they struck him with the force of a physical blow. He had never seen Silas Blackwood before in his life. He was certain of it. But the violation was deeply, horribly personal. The locket was more than silver and paint. It was the last piece of Sarah he had. It was his anchor, his memory, his penance. And now it was gone, taken by a man who looked at him with the eyes of a vengeful ghost from a past he didn't know he had. The quiet life Elias Vance had so carefully constructed had just been burned to the ground. The sun beat down on the cracked earth, turning the red sand to a shimmering, blinding glare. Elias's ranch was nestled in a small, defensible valley at the foot of the Dragoon Mountains. A lonely outpost of civilization against the raw, untamed wilderness. The house was simple, built of sturdy timber. He'd felled himself with a porch that overlooked a sea of sagebrush and distant, hazy mesas. It was a silent place, a place of ghosts. Sarah had loved this land. She had planned the garden that now grew wild with stubborn desert flowers. Her laughter still echoed in the whisper of the wind through the cottonwoods by the creek if he listened hard enough. For 10 years Elias had lived with that ghost, his guilt a constant companion. He had been away on a marshal's duty hunting down a gang of rustlers when the fever took her. He returned to a cold house and a fresh grave. He'd traded his badge for a shovel and a branding iron, hoping the hard labor would scour the pain from his soul. But grief was a stubborn stain. The ranch was his sanctuary, and his prison a monument to the life he had failed to protect. The days following the robbery were a blur of cold fury and gnawing confusion. Sheriff Miller, a man whose spine seemed to be made of jelly, had been useless. "We'll look into it, Elias," he'd said, avoiding eye contact. his hands fidgeting with the brim of his hat. But Blackwood, he's got connections, powerful ones. We have to be careful. Elias knew what careful meant. It meant doing nothing. Blackwood's gang was a cancer spreading through the territory. They weren't just raiding and robbing, they were methodically seizing property. Rumors swirled of ranchers being presented with expertly forged deeds of families, intimidated into selling their land for pennies on the dollar. Redemption was slowly being strangled, and its lawman was too afraid to tighten the noose on the real criminals. Elias cleaned his Colt Peacemaker, the familiar weight of it in his hands, both a comfort and a curse. The oiled steel gleamed in the lamplight. Each part moved with a smooth, deadly precision he knew as well as his own heartbeat. He had promised Sarah he was done with this life. He had promised himself. But Blackwood had made it personal. The locket was a declaration of war. He was running a patch of oilcloth over the barrel when he heard the horses. Not the slow, ambling gait of a neighbor, but the confident, rhythmic tread of several riders approaching at once. He set the gun down on the table, his body tensing. Through the window, he saw 3 men dismount. They were hard-faced and armed, their movements arrogant. They didn't bother with the gate, simply tethering their horses to the porch rail as if they owned the place. Elias stepped out onto the porch, letting the screen door slam shut behind him. He stood with his arms crossed, his shadow long in the late afternoon sun. "This is private property," he said, his voice flat and even. The leader, a hulking man with a scar that split his left eyebrow, sneered. He held up a rolled piece of paper. "Not anymore, it ain't. We got the deed. Signed and sealed. This ranch belongs to the Redemption Development Company now." The Redemption Development Company was a known front for Silas Blackwood. "That's a lie," Elias said. "This ranch has been in my wife's family for 50 years. It's not for sale." The man unrolled the paper. It looked official, covered in seals and signatures. A masterful forgery. "Says here you sold it last week. Now Mr. Blackwood is a generous man. He's authorizing us to let you gather your personal effects and be on your way. You have 1 hour." Elias's hands slowly uncrossed. The quiet fury that had been simmering inside him for days finally boiled over. This wasn't just about a piece of paper. This was about his home. Sarah's home. The last sanctuary he had in the world. Blackwood wasn't just stealing from him. He was trying to erase him. "You tell Blackwood," Elias said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, "that if he wants this ranch, he can come and try to take it himself." The scarred man laughed, a harsh grating sound. Brave words for an old man. He took a step forward, his hand drifting toward the pistol on his hip. "We can do this easy, or we can do this hard." "It's already hard," Elias replied. The world seemed to slow down. The man's hand closed around his gun butt. Elias moved. He wasn't the aging rancher anymore. He was the marshal. In 2 swift strides, he closed the distance, his left hand grabbing the man's wrist, twisting it brutally until the bone snapped with a sickening crack. The man screamed. Elias's right hand balled into a fist as hard as rock slammed into his jaw. The man collapsed in a heap. The other 2 were stunned for a second, then drew their guns. But they were clumsy, panicked. Elias was already moving, using the fallen man as a shield as he dove back inside the house. A gunshot splintered the doorframe next to his head. He landed, rolled, and came up with a peacemaker in his hand. The fight was over before it truly began. Elias didn't shoot to kill. He was a lawman, retired or not. 2 shots, precise and economical. The first shattered the gun hand of one man. The second took the other in the thigh, sending him sprawling into the dust, howling in pain. Silence descended again, broken only by the groans of the wounded. Elias stood in the doorway, the Colt smoking in his hand. The scent of gunpowder, sharp and acrid, filled the air. It was a smell he had tried to forget, the perfume of death and violence. He had been pulled back into the world he'd fought so hard to escape. Blackwood had given him no choice. This was no longer just about a locket. It was about survival. It was about redemption. He dragged the three men to their wagon, patched them up enough to stop the bleeding, and sent them on their way with a final chilling message. Tell Blackwood I'm coming for him, and I'm coming for what's mine. As the wagon rattled away, leaving a trail of dust and blood in its wake, Elias knew his quiet life was over. The ghost of the marshal had been resurrected. The law and redemption offered no recourse. Sheriff Miller, when confronted with the forged deed and the tale of the assault, had turned a pale shade of green. Elias, you can't go starting a war, he'd pleaded. Blackwood will burn this town to the ground. He's already holding the match, Elias had replied, disgust thick in his voice, before turning his back on the sheriff and the hollow authority he represented. He knew what came next. Blackwood wouldn't send clumsy thugs a second time. He would send killers. Elias couldn't fight an army from his ranch. He had to take the fight to them, but he was one man against a syndicate. He needed leverage information. He needed to understand the ghost who wore his brother's face in his memory. No, that was a mistake. He didn't know yet that Silas was Caleb. He needed to understand the man who haunted him. His investigation began in the dusty town archives, a place that smelled of decaying paper and forgotten history. He spent 2 days poring over land deeds, business licenses, and shipping manifests, tracing the web of Blackwood's influence. The Redemption Development Company was a phantom, its ownership records a labyrinth of shell corporations leading back to banks in St. Louis and Chicago. But there were patterns. Every piece of land Blackwood acquired bordered the Dragoon Mountains, specifically the northern slopes, rich with old-growth timber and rumors of untapped silver veins. His ambition was territorial. On the third night, following a lead from a drunk and disgruntled freight clerk, Elias found himself outside a warehouse on the edge of town. A sliver of moon offered little light, casting long, distorted shadows that danced like specters. According to the clerk, this was where Blackwood stored his ill-gotten gains before shipping them east. He moved through the darkness with the practiced silence of a hunter. The lock on the side door was cheap. It yielded to a piece of bent wire in under a minute. Inside the warehouse was a cavern of shadows filled with crates and barrels. The air was stale, thick with the smell of sawdust and machine oil. He lit a match, the small flame pushing back the oppressive dark, and began his search. He found ledgers detailing illegal logging operations, payrolls for hired guns, and correspondence that implicated half the officials in the county, including Sheriff Miller. Blackwood's corruption was deeper and more systematic than anyone had dared to imagine. But none of it explained the personal nature of his vendetta. None of it explained the locket. A floorboard creaked behind him. Elias dropped the match and drew his Colt in a single fluid motion, spinning into a crouch. A figure lunged from the darkness. He fired the blast, deafening in the enclosed space. The bullet went wide, thudding into a wooden crate as he was tackled, his gun knocked from his hand. He grunted as his shoulder hit the hard floor. He rolled, grappling with his attacker, a large, powerful man who smelled of whiskey and cheap cigars. They were not alone. 2 more shapes emerged from the shadows, guns glinting. It was an ambush. Elias fought with a desperate, cold ferocity. He drove an elbow into his attacker's throat, broke the man's hold, and scrambled for his gun. A boot slammed down on his hand, pinning it to the floor. Pain, white-hot and blinding, shot up his arm. The man above him raised his pistol to deliver the final blow. Suddenly, the warehouse door burst open. A figure stood silhouetted against the night sky, a rifle at their shoulder. The rifle cracked, and the man standing over Elias crumpled to the floor. The other two gunmen turned startled, and the silhouetted figure fired again, the shots precise and deadly. One man went down. The other, seeing the odds had turned, fled into the night. Elias kicked his pistol free and got to his feet, his hand throbbing. His savior stepped into the faint moonlight, filtering through the open door. It was a woman. She was tall and slender, dressed in practical buckskin with long, dark hair braided down her back. Her face was stern, her eyes sharp and intelligent. She held the rifle with an easy, familiar competence. "You're Elias Vance," she said. It wasn't a question. Her voice was low and steady, with an earthy quality like the sound of a river running over smooth stones. "I am," Elias managed, flexing his bruised hand. "And I owe you my thanks." "Gratitude won't stop Blackwood's saws from cutting down our forests," she replied, her gaze unwavering. "My name is Serafina. My people live in the mountains. The same mountains Blackwood is trying to steal." Elias had heard tales of the reclusive communities that lived deep in the dragoons people who kept to the old ways, shunning the towns and their politics. He had dismissed them as folklore. "His logging operations are poisoning our water and driving away the game." Serafina continued. "We have tried to reason with his men. They answered with threats. We watched you. We saw you were the only one in that town willing to fight back." "I'm fighting my own war," Elias said grimly. "It is the same war," she corrected him. "Blackwood is a disease. He thinks he can own the land, but the land owns itself. He threatens your home. He threatens ours. We should fight him together." Elias looked from the determined woman to the bodies on the floor. He had been a loner for so long, trusting no one but himself. But she was right. His enemy was her enemy. An alliance was logical necessary. He was ambushed and would have been killed. He needed help. "What do you propose?" he asked. "You know how men like him think," she said. "You understand their laws and their greed. We know the mountains. We know every trail, every cave, every shadow. We can move where his men cannot. Together, we can find his weakness." Elias thought of the locket in Blackwood's pocket, of the cryptic whisper in the bank. His fight was about more than land or money. But to get to the heart of that mystery, he first had to survive. He had been left for dead once tonight. Serafina had saved him. He nodded slowly. "All right, we fight him together." In the cool pre-dawn light, Serafina led him away from the town, not towards his ranch, but up into the foothills of the mountains. "His men will be watching your home," she explained. "You'll be safer with us for now." The path was steep and treacherous, a barely there trail that would be invisible to an untrained eye. They moved with a silent, steady pace. As the sun began to rise, casting a golden glow over the rugged peaks, Elias felt a strange sense of displacement. He was leaving his world behind and entering another, a world of ancient trees and hidden paths, guided by a woman whose people were as mysterious as the mountains they called home. It was a reluctant alliance born of desperation, but as he followed Serafina into the deep, quiet canyons, he felt the first flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. The community was hidden in a valley so perfectly concealed, it felt like a secret world. Waterfalls cascaded down sheer rock faces into a crystal-clear lake, and modest, sturdy homes were built into the landscape itself, nestled amongst ancient pines and oaks. It was a place of profound peace, a stark contrast to the dust and violence of redemption. Serafina's people were quiet and watchful, their eyes holding a deep generational wisdom. They were not warriors in the way Elias understood the term, but they were survivors, and their strength rooted in their connection to the land. They treated his bruised hand with a poultice of herbs that soothed the pain almost instantly. They offered him food-roasted venison and wild berries, and a place by their central fire, accepting his presence with a cautious but undeniable grace. He and Serafina became a strange, effective team. By day they were ghosts in the mountains, observing Blackwood's logging camps from high ridges. Serafina's knowledge of the terrain was astonishing. She could read a broken twig like a page in a book and predict the weather from the scent of the wind. Elias, in turn, analyzed the camps with a marshal's eye, noting their routines, their supply lines, their defensive weaknesses. "They are clumsy," Serafina observed one afternoon, as they watched a group of loggers struggle to move a massive felled pine. "They fight the mountain. That is why they will lose." "They have numbers and guns," Elias countered, his gaze fixed on the rifle-toting guards. "The mountain has time and patience," she replied simply. At night, they would return to the valley and piece together what they had learned. Elias began to understand that Blackwood wasn't just clear-cutting timber. He was systematically searching for something, his operations concentrating around a series of old abandoned silver mines that riddled the northern peaks. His personal investigation, however, felt stalled. The key to Blackwood's motive lay not in the mountains, but in a past Elias couldn't access. The cryptic phrase, "You took everything from me," plagued his thoughts. He searched his memory, combing through the faces of every outlaw he'd ever arrested, every family he'd ever wronged in the line of duty. None of them fit. Silas Blackwood had appeared out of nowhere. One evening, seeking refuge from the gnawing mystery, Elias decided to retrieve some things from his ranch. He needed his father's old journals and records, hoping they might contain a clue. With Serafina guiding him through a network of hidden trails, he slipped back down the mountain under the cover of darkness. His house was just as he'd left it, but it felt different, violated by the memory of the attack. A thick layer of dust covered everything. In the bedroom, he found the old leather-bound trunk where he kept his family's keepsakes. He lifted the heavy lid, the scent of cedar and thyme filling the small room. He sorted through his father's methodical records of the ranch, his mother's letters, his own sparse mementos from his years as a marshal. At the very bottom, wrapped in oilcloth, was a small stack of daguerreotypes. He unwrapped them carefully. There was one of his parents on their wedding day. Another of himself as a young boy, puffed up with pride, holding a wooden toy horse. And then he saw it. It was a photograph of two boys standing in front of the ranch house. He was about 10, gangly and serious. Standing next to him, a hand on his shoulder, was a smaller, younger boy with a mischievous grin and a shock of unruly dark hair. Caleb, his little brother. Elias's breath caught in his throat. He hadn't looked at this picture in 30 years. The fire had taken not just their parents, but Caleb too. Or so he had always believed. He'd been away at the time, working on a cattle drive. He returned to a smoldering ruin, and the town's sorrowful story, a lantern knocked over in the barn, a fire that spread too fast. They never found Caleb's body, assuming it had been consumed by the inferno. The guilt of his absence, of not being there to save them, had been the defining tragedy of his life, a wound that had never truly healed. He stared at the small face in the photograph, at the bright, intelligent eyes. And then a cold dread washed over him. He had seen those eyes before. He saw them every time he closed his own. They were the same cold, steel-colored eyes that had stared back at him from across the bank in Redemption, Silas Blackwood's eyes. It couldn't be. It was impossible. A trick of light, of grief, of a mind desperate for answers. But the more he looked, the more certain he became. The shape of the face, the line of the jaw. It was him. Grown hardened, twisted by time and hatred. But it was him. His mind raced desperately, connecting the dots. Blackwood's inexplicable knowledge of him. The way he moved with an aristocrat's grace, their father had insisted on teaching them both etiquette, a strange affectation for a rancher. A turn of phrase Blackwood had used in the bank, an unfortunate but necessary interruption, was something their father used to say with the same dry, ironic tone. Caleb, his brother, was alive, and he was Silas Blackwood. The revelation hit him with the force of a physical blow. He sank onto the edge of the bed, the photograph trembling in his hand. This wasn't a random act of greed. This wasn't a stranger's vendetta. This was personal. This was familial. The fire hadn't been the end of his family's story. It had been the beginning of a new terrible chapter. The whisper in the bank now made a horrifying kind of sense. You took everything from me. What had Caleb meant? Elias had been 100 miles away when the ranch burned. He had lost his family too. He felt a hand on his shoulder and looked up to see Serafina standing in the doorway, her expression one of quiet concern. She had seen the change in him, the color draining from his face. "What is it?" she asked softly. Elias couldn't find the words. He simply held up the photograph. He looked from the smiling boy in the picture to the haunted expression in Serafina's eyes, and he knew his quest had changed. This was no longer about justice or reclaiming a stolen locket. This was about confronting the ghost of his own blood, a brother he thought long dead, who had returned from the ashes, not as a survivor, but as a reckoning. The knowledge that Silas Blackwood was his brother Caleb settled in Elias's soul like a shard of ice. Every interaction, every threat, every violent act was recast in the terrible light of this truth. His brother, consumed by a 3-decade-old hatred, was systematically destroying his life as an act of elaborate, patient revenge. Elias knew he couldn't win this war with bullets alone. He had to face Caleb to understand the lie that had festered for 30 years. He arranged a meeting. Using a compromised telegraph operator in a neighboring town, he sent a simple unsigned message to one of Blackwood's known associates, the Silver Queen Mine. Sunset. Come alone. The Silver Queen was a neutral, abandoned claim, halfway between redemption and the mountains, a place of ghosts fitting for their reunion. He told Serafina his plan. She was against it. "It's a trap," she insisted, her dark eyes filled with worry. "He will kill you." "He could have killed me in the bank," Elias countered, "or in the warehouse. He wants something more than my death. He wants me to know why." He looked at her, his expression grim. "This is something I have to do alone." As the sun began its descent, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple, Elias rode towards the Silver Queen. The mine's entrance was a dark maw in the side of a hill, its skeletal headframe stark against the dying light. He dismounted, tethering his horse to a withered juniper tree, and waited. Caleb arrived as the last sliver of sun vanished below the horizon. He was alone, just as the message had requested, riding a magnificent black stallion that moved with the same fluid arrogance as its master. He dismounted and walked towards Elias, his long black coat billowing around him like the wings of a crow. "I confess I was intrigued by your message," Marshal Caleb said, his voice laced with its usual mocking amusement. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Elias didn't waste time on pleasantries. He reached into his coat and pulled out the daguerreotype, holding it up in the twilight. "I know who you are, Caleb." The name spoken aloud after 30 years hung in the air between them. For the first time, Elias saw a crack in his brother's perfectly composed facade. A flicker of shock, of raw emotion crossed his face before it was smoothed over again by the cold mask of Silas Blackwood. Caleb Vance died in a fire a long time ago, he said, his voice tight. Did he? Elias took a step closer. Or did he just let everyone believe he did? Why Caleb? Why all this? The bank, the ranch. Sarah's locket. A bitter, humorless smile touched Caleb's lips. Sarah, he mused, as if tasting the name. She was always your weakness. As for the rest, consider it repayment for a debt long overdue. The debt you owe me for the night you destroyed our family. The accusation was so absurd, so baseless, that Elias could only stare. I was 100 miles away. I had nothing to do with the fire. Didn't you? Caleb's voice rose, losing its polished edge and taking on the raw, ragged anger of a wounded boy. You were never there. Always off playing hero, chasing some worthless bounty while Father and I were left to manage the ranch. He was in trouble, Elias. Deep in debt to dangerous men. He needed you. I needed you. But you were gone. The pieces began to fall into a terrible, misshapen puzzle. What trouble father was the most honorable man I ever knew? Caleb laughed, a harsh, broken sound that echoed in the desolate landscape. Honorable. Our father was a gambler and a fool. He mortgaged the ranch to the hilt, made promises to men who settled their accounts with fire and bullets. The night of the fire, they came to collect. It wasn't an accident, Elias. They said it. They were going to kill us all. He paused, his chest heaving, the memory fresh and vivid, even after 3 decades. I escaped. I hid in the storm cellar and watched the house burn, listened to them scream. When it was over, I was alone. A boy with nothing but the clothes on his back and a heart full of hate. I waited for you to come back to find me. But you never even looked. You buried 2 empty coffins and moved on with your life. You erased me. Elias felt the ground shift beneath his feet. His entire past, the foundations of his life, were crumbling. His heroic father, a fraud. The tragic accident, a brutal murder. And Caleb, his lost little brother, a survivor who believed he had been abandoned. I didn't know Elias whispered the words, feeling hollow, inadequate. They told me, everyone told me you were gone. And you believed them because it was easier. Caleb sneered, his composure returning. You built a new life, became a famous marshal, married a beautiful woman. While I clawed my way up from nothing, fueled by one single purpose, to take back what was mine. To take back everything you had, this land, this town. It was all built on the ashes of our family. I'm just claiming my inheritance. He wanted not just revenge, but restitution. His entire criminal empire was a twisted, monstrous attempt to rebuild the life he felt Elias had stolen from him. It doesn't have to be this way. Caleb. Elias pleaded, a desperate, unfamiliar feeling. We can stop this. It's too late for that, Caleb said, his eyes turning to ice. I'm going to take everything from you, Elias. Your home, your reputation, your hope. And when you have nothing left, just like I did then, you will understand. He turned and walked back to his horse. The meeting was over. There was no room for negotiation, no path to reconciliation. Caleb's wound was too deep, his hatred too ingrained. As Caleb rode away into the gathering darkness, Elias felt a profound and chilling despair. He had found his brother, only to discover a monster wearing his face. And he knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that Caleb would escalate. He would not stop until one of them was destroyed. To force a final confrontation, Caleb unleashed a new level of calculated cruelty. He needed to isolate Elias completely, to turn him from a town hero into a reviled outcast. His first move was against Tom Miller, the owner of the livery stable, a kind, elderly man who had been a friend of Elias's father. Tom had been quietly supportive, offering Elias information and a sympathetic ear. One morning, the stable was found burned to the ground, the horses scattered or killed. Tom was missing. A note pinned to the smoldering door frame with a Bowie knife claimed responsibility. It was signed with a crude drawing of a feather and a serpent, a symbol associated with the mountain communities. The town, already on edge from Blackwood's tightening grip, erupted in fear and anger. Sheriff Miller, seizing the opportunity to deflect from his own incompetence, publicly accused the mountain savages of the crime. Caleb's plan was diabolical in its simplicity. He simultaneously kidnapped an innocent man and framed Serafina's people, turning the townsfolk against Elias's only allies. Panic spread like wildfire. A posse was formed, ready to ride into the dragoons and enact their own brutal form of justice. Elias and Serafina were caught in a closing vice. "He is trying to start a war between our people." Serafina set her face grim as they watched the armed men gather in redemption from a high, hidden ridge. "He will use the chaos to seize the rest of the land. He's not just after the land." Elias said, his voice heavy with the weight of his family's tragedy. "He's trying to take away anyone I care about. He's taking Tom to force my hand." A message arrived that evening, delivered by a frightened boy who had been paid a silver dollar. It was a single sentence on a piece of paper. "The Oro Perdido mine. Midnight. Bring the original deed to your father's ranch, the one you think proves your claim. Come alone, or the old man dies." The Oro Perdido, the lost gold mine, was one of the deepest and most treacherous in the range, a labyrinth of decaying tunnels. It was Caleb's chosen stage for their final act. As they prepared, a storm began to gather over the peaks. The sky turned a bruised purple, and the wind howled through the canyons, a mournful, ominous sound. "You cannot go alone." Serafina stated, her hand resting on the stock of her rifle. "This is our fight now." Elias looked at her, at the fierce loyalty in her eyes. He had spent a decade pushing everyone away, convinced he was destined for a life of solitary penance. But Serafina had broken through his walls. He couldn't bear the thought of losing her, too. "It's too dangerous, Serafina." "Living is dangerous," she countered. "Letting that man win is worse. I know those mines better than he does. You need me." She was right. He couldn't let pride be his downfall. "All right," he conceded. "But we do this my way." They made their way to the Oro Perdido as the storm broke in full force. Rain lashed down, turning the rocky ground to slick mud. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the skeletal ruins of the mine works in brief, ghostly flashes. Thunder rolled through the mountains, a sound like the gods of the mountain were at war. It was a night fit for a reckoning. The entrance to the Oro Perdido mine gaped like a wound in the mountainside, exhaling a cold, damp breath that smelled of wet rock and decay. Elias and Serafina slipped inside the roar of the storm outside, immediately softening to a distant, muffled rumble. The darkness within was absolute, broken only by the flickering yellow light of the single lantern Elias carried. Dripping water echoed in the oppressive silence, each drop a tick of a clock counting down. "He'll be deep inside," Serafina whispered, her voice barely disturbing the still air. "In the main chamber. It's the most stable part of the mine, but the tunnels leading to it are a maze." "He's expecting me to come down the main shaft," Elias reasoned. "Is there another way?" Serafina nodded. "There's an old ventilation shaft. It's narrow, but it will bring us out above the chamber. We'll have the high ground." They navigated the treacherous side tunnels, Serafina leading the way, with an unnerving confidence. The air grew colder, the timbers holding up the rock ceiling groaning under the weight of the mountain. Flashes of lightning from the storm outside occasionally penetrated through cracks in the rock, casting fleeting, monstrous shadows on the walls. As they neared the main chamber, they could hear voices. Caleb was not alone. Elias extinguished their lantern, plunging them into near total darkness. They crept the final few feet to the edge of the ventilation shaft and peered down. The chamber below was a vast cavern lit by a dozen lanterns that cast a warm, hellish glow. Caleb stood in the center looking every bit the theatrical villain, his black coat immaculate. Tom Miller was tied to a support beam looking pale and terrified. 3 of Caleb's hired guns stood guard, their rifles at the ready. "You're late, brother." Caleb called out into the darkness of the main tunnel, his voice echoing unnaturally. He clearly expected Elias to make a grand entrance. Elias exchanged a look with Serafina. He drew his Colt, its weight a familiar comfort. She readied her rifle. This was it. He took a deep breath and shouted, his voice booming from his unseen perch. "Let Tom go, Caleb. This is between us." Caleb and his men spun around, their faces a mixture of confusion and alarm as they tried to locate the source of the sound. Clever Elias Caleb called back a grudging respect in his tone. "Always the tactician. But you're still in my trap. Did you bring the deed?" "The deed is a lie, and you know it," Elias yelled. "Just like everything else you've built your life on." He gave Serafina a nod. It was time to shatter Caleb's carefully constructed world. "You blame me for what happened." Elias's voice echoed through the cavern. "But you never knew the whole truth. Did you ever wonder why those men came for Father? Why they were so determined to burn everything?" Caleb was silent, his face a thunderous mask of impatience. "Because Father wasn't just a gambler," Elias continued, his voice ringing with conviction. "He was their partner. He was laundering money through the ranch for a gang of silver smugglers. The same smugglers who owned this very mine. He tried to cheat them, Caleb. He tried to run with their money. The fire wasn't just revenge. It was business." A flash of lightning illuminated the chamber, and in that split second, Elias saw the shock on his brother's face. The story of their father's noble victimhood had been the bedrock of Caleb's hatred. Elias was taking a hammer to it. "You're lying," Caleb screamed, his voice cracking. "Am I?" Elias countered. "Their ledger is still down here, buried under a rock slide in the east tunnel. I found the reference in Father's old journals. That's what you've really been looking for, isn't it? Not just timber or silver. Proof." The second twist, the final devastating secret, hung in the air. Their father was not a hero, not even a tragic fool. He was a criminal whose greed had destroyed his own family. Caleb's entire crusade, his 30-year quest for vengeance, was built on a flawed memory. The revelation broke him. Caleb's face contorted in a mask of rage and disbelief. "Kill him," he shrieked at his men. "Kill them all." The cavern erupted in gunfire. Serafina fired first, her rifle shot echoing like a clap of thunder. One of the gunmen crumpled. Elias opened fire with his Colt, the muzzle flashes blinding in the dark. He shot not to kill, but to disarm his bullet, striking a rifle from one man's hands, a pistol from another's. The remaining gunmen fired wildly up at their position, bullets ricocheting off the rock around them. The shootout was a chaotic symphony of noise and light. Thunder from the storm above mingled with the blasts of gunfire below. Serafina, using her knowledge of the mine, dislodged a loose rock with the butt of her rifle. It tumbled down the shaft, causing a minor rock slide that sent the last 2 gunmen scrambling for cover. In the confusion, Elias and Seraphina rappelled down a rope into the chamber. Elias landed and immediately cut Tom Miller free. "Get out of here," he yelled, pushing the terrified man towards the main tunnel. He turned to face his brother. Caleb stood alone amidst the chaos, his polished elegance gone replaced by the wild-eyed desperation of a man whose world had just ended. He held a silver-plated revolver in his hand, pointed directly at Elias. "You've lost Caleb," Elias said softly, his own gun still raised. "He was our father," Caleb whispered, his voice trembling with a child's grief. "He was supposed to protect us." "He failed," Elias said, his heart aching with a sorrow 30 years in the making. "He failed us both. But your war is over." A massive clap of thunder shook the very foundations of the mountain. The old support timbers groaned, and dust rained down from the ceiling. The mine was becoming unstable. Caleb raised his gun, his eyes filled with a terrible final clarity. He wasn't aiming at Elias. He was aiming at Seraphina as she tried to pull Elias towards the exit. Elias didn't hesitate. He fired. The shot was true. Caleb cried out, dropping his revolver as the bullet tore through his shoulder. He staggered back, clutching the wound, his face a mask of pain and shock. He looked at Elias, his brother, not with hatred, but with a look of profound, devastating betrayal. The ceiling above them gave way. A cascade of rock and timber rained down, separating them. Elias and Seraphina scrambled back as the section of the mine where Caleb stood collapsed in a deafening roar of falling stone. When the dust began to settle, the way back was blocked by a mountain of rubble. Caleb was gone, buried beneath the weight of the mountain and his own tragic history. Or so it seemed. A weak groan came from the pile of rock. He was alive. They dug for hours. Elias, Seraphina, and a recovered Tom Miller worked with a frantic, desperate energy, their bare hands raw and bleeding, as they pulled away rocks and splintered timbers. The storm outside had passed, and the first light of dawn was filtering into the mine's entrance when they finally cleared a path. Caleb was alive barely. His leg was pinned beneath a massive beam, and his face was pale with pain and blood loss. He looked up as Elias knelt beside him, his steel-colored eyes clouded with defeat. They carried him back to redemption, a grim procession under the clean, rain-washed sky. The town was in an uproar. Tom Miller's testimony, combined with the ledgers Elias had recovered from the mine, exposed Blackwood's entire criminal enterprise and cleared Seraphina's people of any wrongdoing. Sheriff Miller was arrested, his complicity laid bare for all to see. The reign of Silas Blackwood was over. Caleb was taken not to the jail, but to the doctor's office, where he was placed under guard. Elias sat by his bedside through the night, watching his brother's fitful, pain-filled sleep. The face on the pillow was no longer the cruel, mocking visage of Silas Blackwood, but the familiar lost face of Caleb Vance. When he finally awoke, his eyes were clear. The hatred was gone, replaced by a vast, empty weariness. "You should have let me die in there," he rasped, his voice weak. "I couldn't," Elias replied simply. "I already lost you once." They talked for a long time. There were no more lies, no more illusions, just the painful, unvarnished truth of their family's legacy. They spoke of their father's weakness, of their mother's quiet strength, and of the two boys who had stood for a photograph on a sunny afternoon, their whole lives ahead of them. There were no easy apologies, no miraculous forgiveness. The chasm between them was too wide, filled with too much pain and too many years. But as the sun rose, a grim, quiet understanding settled between them. "What happens now?" Caleb asked. "You'll stand trial," Elias said. "You'll answer for what you've done, but you'll do it as Caleb Vance. Silas Blackwood is dead." Elias left the doctor's office and stepped out into the morning sun. Redemption felt like a different town. The air was lighter. People met his gaze not with fear or suspicion, but with gratitude. He was a hero again, but the title felt hollow. The victory was ashes in his mouth. He found Serafina by the creek at the edge of town, skipping stones across the water's surface. She looked up as he approached, her expression calm and knowing. "The past is a heavy burden to carry," she said softly. "It is," Elias agreed. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the silver locket. He had found it in Caleb's coat. He clicked it open, looking at Sarah's smiling face. For 10 years, her memory had been a source of guilt, a reminder of his failure. Now he saw it differently. It was a memory of love, a part of his story, but not the end of it. He stayed in Redemption. The town needed rebuilding, and he found he no longer craved the solitude of his ranch. He worked alongside the townsfolk and Serafina's people, their community slowly, cautiously bridging the gap that Blackwood had tried to create. He combined his knowledge of ranching with their deep understanding of the land, finding a new purpose, not in chasing ghosts, but in cultivating a future. Several months later, Elias stood in the living room of his ranch house. The dust was gone, replaced by the scent of fresh-cut flowers and wood smoke from the hearth. Serafina was there with him, her presence a quiet, steady warmth that had filled the empty spaces in his life. On the rough-hewn wooden mantelpiece, he placed the silver locket. It gleamed in the firelight, a tribute to a love that had shaped him. Then next to it, he set down a small, intricately carved wooden bird, a gift from Serafina made from the wood of a mountain pine. The two objects sat side by side, one representing the past he had finally made peace with, the other a symbol of the future he was ready to embrace. He looked from the locket to the bird, from the ghost of one love to the promise of another, and for the first time in a very long time, Elias Vance felt whole. He had walked through the fire of his past and emerged not unscathed, but redeemed.